In the year of 1932, the Lyonais family moved into a big old gray house located in the hills of North Dakota. It was springtime. Down below the house was a spring of bubbling water where frogs and water snakes were plentiful. On the hills around the house were many rocks with clumps of sagebrush here and there. It was an exciting day for Annie and Allie, who were little girls ages 5 and 6. With their old sheepdog, they checked out all the details of the property. Big sister Helen was busy helping Mom and Dad get settled. In the evening, Mom lit her lamp and put it on the table. The girls went out to the old pump to get some buckets of water and carried in wood from Mom's old cook stove. The toilet was 100 feet from the house, and in the dark it was a scary trip to make. The family had a few cows, some chickens, and a couple of pigs. With his horses, Dad farmed many acres, but since there was little rain, the crops would burn up in the hot sun. At night, the coyotes would stand on the hill near the house and howl. They were in search of food, but Mama's chickens were locked up safely in the old chicken coop. Several times in the hot summer, an electric storm would come up with lots of thunder and lightning. Annie and Alice would run into the house, get into their feather bed, which was a mattress filled with chicken feathers, and were safe from the lightning. Mom had to wash clothes by hand or on an old scrub board in a tub of water. Then she hung them on a clothesline to dry. The same tub was used for a bath on Saturday night. Annie and Allie had few toys, a ball, a stick as a bat, a wagon, sled, and a deck of cards, as our family was very poor. In the summer, we went barefoot to save our shoes for school. With no refrigerator, Mom canned most of her vegetables and meat. Milk was kept in a bucket which hung on a rope down deep in the well. Boards were kept over the well so that nothing could fall into it. It was fall now and was time for Helen to walk with Annie and Allie to school, which was about a half a mile to a one-room schoolhouse. Helen was in the 8th grade. Annie and Allie were first graders. There were 12 kids in the school. The teacher, who was a young Indian girl, played her guitar and sang with her students. She also had a program once a month and invited the parents to come and watch. At Christmas time, her students were in a play called The Christmas Carol. Allie got to be Tiny Tim since she was the youngest in the school and there were no little boys. Many times walking home from school, a snowstorm or blizzard would come up and the snow got very deep. The girls would run home as it was very cold. They would warm up by the old stove that burned coal. One Saturday the sun was shining, even though it was cold outside. Helen walked to a neighbor's house for a birthday party. When the party was over, the wind started to blow hard. A blizzard was coming on, and Helen felt that she had to get home as her parents would be looking for her. The people tried to make her stay. She put on her hat, coat, and gloves and headed for home across the pasture, which was about a mile from home. The wind and snow blew hard. Helen lost her way, but ended up in the barnyard. Mama and an aunt was watching out the window when they saw what looked like a snowman fall by the fence. They ran out and found Helen lying unconscious. Her hat and gloves were gone. They carried her to the house, and when she awoke, she was in terrible pain. Her face, arms, and legs were frost-bitten. Dad came home a short time later. with his horses and sled. The next day, when she was taken to the doctor, he said since she had lost consciousness that she would have lived only a few minutes more had she not been found. The winters were long and cold. 40 below zero was common. There was no telephone, radio, or TV. The only news was a local newspaper that came once a week in the mail. Annette and Allie, an old dog Shep, had many good times sleighing down the steep hills, but daylight was short after school, as the chores had to be done. Hauling water and coal for the stove, cleaning the lamp chimney with newspapers, as it got smoked up every evening. There was one hanging lamp in the kitchen and one table lamp in the front room. If someone needed to go out into another room, the lamp would be carried in there, while the others sat in the dark until the lamp returned to the table. A lantern was used when going outside at night, as it was very dark, unless it was a moonlit night, of course. Springtime was welcome, with desert flowers blooming on the hills, and the little creek below the house was full of running water again. The water was clear, and the girls spent time catching frogs and watching water snakes swim here and there, catching mosquitoes on the water. In the old straw barn nearby were many bull snakes who fed on rodents. Once, when Helen was milking a cow, a large bull snake dangled from the ceiling of the straw barn, almost to the back of the cow, scaring the cow and knocking the bucket of milk over. Helen ran to tell Dad, since the snakes nested there, it was hard to avoid this sort of thing. Helen had an old white horse who was very gentle. She called him Tommy Lad. She rode him for pleasure and to get the cows when they were at a distance over the hills. She gave Annie and Allie many rides on old Tommy. Once, when she had given Allie a ride, the saddle cinch slipped loose, dumping Helen and Allie under the horse. He stopped, looked down to see what happened, and never moved until Helen re-cinched the saddle, and he was told to giddy up. Of course, Allie did some crying, as it was a scary fall, but she was unhurt. Thanks to the gentle horse, Helen had landed on some rocks, but not seriously hurt. In the spring, Mom had gone to the hospital and had a baby boy. He was called Johnny. Annie and Allie was so happy to have a little brother, but he wasn't very well and cried a lot. He kept Mama up at night, and the months went by, and little Johnny cried more and more than ever. So Dad took Mom and Baby to the hospital. Mama stayed there with Baby for about 2 days, and then he died. The doctors didn't know what was wrong with him, so could not fix his problem. When the folks came home and told the girls, they cried for days. It came time for his funeral, and he looked like a little angel as he lay in his little white coffin, his tiny little hands folded, and such a sweet little face. This was late November, and the family was so sad. Even Christmas was empty and sad that year. The teacher, Miss Steike, was very understanding. She tried to console the family as the winter went on. As usual, it was very cold. Helen went back to Willow City, where she stayed the rest of the year to go to high school. There was not much snow so as spring came, the creeks didn't have much water, and the pretty spring flowers on the hills soon dried up for lack of moisture. Dad planted his crops as usual, but there was no rain. The creeks dried up. Slowly the crops and the grass on the hills all dried up, and the cattle were running out of hay. The hills were getting to look like a desert. The wind blew dust into black clouds. There were many army worms and clouds of locusts, large grasshoppers, that came and ate what was left as foliage. Soon the well was going dry, and the government sent men out to shoot the cattle and pigs. Because of the lack of food, they were starving. Dad and Mom had a sack of navy beans and few jars of canned fruit left in the pantry. They were desperate. Mama wrote to her brother, who lived in Montana where they had water and crops. She asked if we could come and work for him somehow. He wrote back and said, "I just built a new chicken house out of logs, and you can come and stay in there and work in the fields for me." They packed our things and headed for Montana. Having arrived there, we found a log building about 10 by 20 with a dirt floor. This was our home for 2 summers and a winter. Dad brought the team of horses, us, and an old Shep, the dog. Mom and Dad, Annie and Allie, worked hard in the sugar beet fields along with our cousins. Soon Helen came home from school and also worked hard in the fields. But we had food, eggs, meat, butter, and milk for our labor. What would we have done if that uncle and family had not taken us in? The summer was also fun as we got to go swimming in a muddy irrigation ditch, ride a Shetland pony, and play with our cousins. My uncle also would go to town and hire bums who were without work, take them home, and they stayed in a bunkhouse on the property. My mama cooked for 10 beet workers 3 meals a day for 2 summers. She had to bake everything, carry in the water from the well and wood for the old cook stove. There was no electricity or plumbing. We all worked hard but helped and loved each other. Because Annie and Allie went barefoot in the summer, the stickers and stubbed toes were many. Old Shep was always beside us girls to lick the sore toes or share a piece of bread. Swimming in the muddy irrigation ditch in the summer was almost a daily routine. On coming home, us girls and cousins looked like mud bathers and would pour buckets of water from the well over each other to wash the mud off. A cousin who liked to dive into a deep spot in the ditch told Allie it was fun. "Try it." She did and nearly drowned. Lucky an older cousin pulled her out in time. It was time for school to start, and Mama had sewed the girls each a couple of dresses with stored away shoes and bulky old cotton socks and jacket, a tablet and pencil. We rode an old school bus to a tiny town called Door. It consisted of a school, post office, and a store, grain elevator, a dance hall, gas pump, and about 10 families who lived there. There were about 50 kids in the 3-room schoolhouse. Helen had gone away to school again, but in the spring when she came back, the family had moved to a house about 2 miles from where they had lived. Mom and Dad had leased the farm from an older couple. The house was bigger, it had a big barn, and pastured many cattle for several farmers in the area. Dad planted corn, potatoes, and grains, so us girls were busy, kept hoeing, and especially the potatoes, and a large patch of watermelons, which the landlord had planted near the house. We could have all we wanted if we just kept the weeds out. The landlord would take the melons to town and sell them. The only fruit available was some plums and choke cherries, which left one's tongue feeling like sandpaper after eating some, and wild bullberries, which were sour as rhubarb, which happened to grow well there. The Yellowstone River was nearby, so fishing was a fun sport. On the banks of the muddy river, bullheads, a small fish, or bony carp could be caught with bamboo poles. The landlord was a fisherman, and he took a boat out in the deepest part of the river, placed his nets, and would catch catfish, sturgeon, and pike, which he sold to the store in the nearby town. He had an ice house where blocks of ice had been cut in the midwinter and packed in sawdust in a hole in the ground. It kept most of the summer, so he could pack his fish in ice when he caught them. We could also use some ice for the ice box, which was used like a refrigerator. The ice would melt, so had to be refilled every couple of days. Helen was a pretty teenage girl by now, and the neighbor boys had an eye on her, especially one that liked to tell stories and brag about his adventures. Another one gave her rides in his rumble-seat car and took her to a few movies. But they both lost out to a handsome farm boy who lived up the road a couple miles. By then, Dad had bought a 40-acre property, mostly trees, near the river, on which he built a crude two-bedroom house on it. The exterior was finished with tar paper, and the inside was bare 2x4s, with linoleum on the floor. This was all he could afford. Helen nailed cardboard on some of the walls and painted them with calcimine, which is a kind of paint. It looked okay, but it wiped off easily. After Helen had finished her high school, she worked in Fairview, a small town nearby, doing housekeeping for someone. Later that fall, she married her handsome farm boy, and they lived in a little shack on the same property that Dad had built. He also had built a small house for his parents, who were elderly, on the same property. They were unable to keep their farm in Williston, North Dakota, because of the severe drought. That had also caused our family to move away. Allie spent much time with Grandpa and Grandma. It was her job to go to the riverbank with Grandpa, where he loved to fish. He would line up his 6 bamboo poles and wait for hours to catch some fish. Most always he caught 3 or 4 6-inch bullheads in an afternoon. He would ask Allie to find him a frog or a toad so that he could use their legs for bait. But Allie felt sorry for the frogs and toads and would find him some bugs instead. That seemed to be all right. Allie spent most of the time digging holes in the sand and playing with old Shep, but was there to keep an eye on Grandpa in case he fell in or something. Annie was helping Mom with the garden and many other things. In the fall, Dad drove the school bus to Door, a very small town. The school had 3 rooms and about 50 kids. Dad drove the bus for about 3 years. In 1940, Annie and Allie went to boarding school about 200 miles away. In the spring, when they came home, we discovered that Helen and Curtis had a tiny dolly, a baby girl. Her name was Joyce. It was a fun summer, but that fall, Helen and Curtis decided to move to Portland, Oregon. Us girls went back to boarding school. Mom and Dad, also Grandpa and Grandma, spent another winter on the property. But in the spring in 41, the family sold the place and rented a house and acreage east of Fairview, another town close by. Grandpa and Grandma had moved to Kalispell, Montana, with another son of theirs. When us girls came home from boarding school, we were surprised to find the folks had moved again. Dad had planted sugar beets so there was plenty of work for the summer, hoeing and harvesting the beets and wheat. The hot summer went on and our family worked hard. It was a very hot summer. At one point, Allie suffered a heat stroke. Dad rushed her to the house, laying her on the kitchen table while Mom kept her cool with a cold water pack. She recovered shortly and in a few days was out in the field again, but kept my straw hat on this time. On Saturday nights, Dad would take us girls and a neighbor girl to a skating rink and was basically our entertainment, along with a movie now and then. In August, it was time for wheat harvest. That meant that Mom had to cook for 12 men for a day or two. Us girls helped in whatever way we could. September and October were beet harvesting time. Us girls stayed out of school to help with the sugar beets. With the help of 3 or 4 other people Dad hired. When it was over, we went back to school. Letters came from Portland along with newspaper clippings. They were from Helen. She kept coaxing the folks to sell out and come there. The papers were full of job ads. Dad would say to Mom, "What can an old farmer do out there?" It was wartime and there were many jobs in Portland. Finally, in late November, we were convinced that we should give it a try. A neighbor bought our livestock and a relative took an old team of horses who were now too old to work. He promised that he would let them live out the rest of their lives in a comfortable environment, which he did as they were getting lame and half blind. Our family loaded a trailer with some of our belongings and pulled it behind Dad's old 36 Chevy car. There were many stops on the way as the old car had some problems, but Dad could seem to fix them each time. As we approached Oregon with its beautiful trees and scenery, it seemed like we were on our way to heaven. The sight of the big city, streetcars, and so on were so exciting to us girls who were young teenagers. As we found our address, the address Helen had given us, we were all exhausted from so many hours on the road. Helen had rented an apartment next door to her and Curtis, which was all furnished, and we happily moved in. Mom was not well, so she immediately took her to a doctor who put her in the hospital. She was suffering from a goiter that nearly choked her to death. She had a surgery and later worked at that hospital to pay off her debt. It was just across the street from our apartment. Curtis had a job all lined up for Dad, working at a galvanizing plant. Dad was most pleased and it worked out very well. He became the boss there about a month later. It was too late to find a school, as we had missed too much time. So Dad said, "You can stay out for the rest of the year, but next fall you are going back to finish your high school." It was near Christmas now, and Montgomery Ward was hiring in their mail order department. So us girls found a job. We worked there until after Christmas, when that job ran out. Then we found a job at a big bag factory a few blocks away. There were very few cars being driven because gas was rationed, so most people rode the streetcar and buses. The town was full of sailors and servicemen because Portland had ships coming and going. Most all the young men 18 and over were in the service. There were many fun times going to dances, movies, and roller skating. Spring and summer went by and it was time to find a Catholic school. We went to Madeline. It was across the river, so we had to ride a bus. After school each day, we worked on a part-time job. Me at Fred Meyer's cashiering, and Annie worked in a service station. which was just across the street from our apartment. Annie was quite the tomboy, so she enjoyed her job, pumping gas and airing tires. When Curtis was called to the Navy, Helen was a few months pregnant, so she and Joyce moved in with us, who had leased a house on Hoyt Street. Later, little Joey was born, and he was sick a lot, so Helen had to take him many times to a doctor. We all loved and pampered him, and Joyce too. When Curtis came home about 2.5 years later, little Joey was about 2 years old. He didn't want anything to do with that man. He thought Grandpa was his daddy. With some persistence from Curtis, he soon accepted his real daddy. Joyce remembered her dad and, of course, was most happy to see him. Soon Curtis and Helen moved back to Columbia Falls, Montana, and bought a little house there. A year later, Dad and Mom moved back to the same town and bought an old hotel they converted into a rooming house, as there was a big demand for housing. The Hungry Horse Dam was being built, and many people were being hired and needed a place to stay. Annette stayed in Portland as she had a good office job. Allie went back to Portland and worked at Dun and Bradstreet, as there was no job in Montana for her. By now, Annie had met her sailor boyfriend. Marilyn waited for him faithfully after he had shipped out. Allie, too, had met her red-headed boy soldier, Roy, and promised to wait for him. He was sent over to Germany to fight in Patton's Third Army. He died in the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. The day after Christmas, my heart was broken. Roy's brother Dean was home on leave. He came to get acquainted with Allie. They cried on each other's shoulder and became good friends. Later, he was discharged from the Air Force. He wanted to date Allie, but still heartbroken, she wanted to be a nun. She went to Everett, Washington for a year, but was sent home because of a wrong motive. A broken heart is not a true vocation. Allie came back to Portland. Dean started to come around when he heard Allie was back, started to date Allie. A year later, Merrill had come from Illinois to find the girl who was waiting for him. Us two couples decided to have a double wedding, so we went to Montana for the wedding ceremony. We went in 2 cars. It was cold, very cold. The mountain roads were icy, but all went well. The wedding was January 24th of 48. Now, 47 years later, Annette and Merrill are still married, 8 kids. One died in an accident. Allie was left a widow 28 years ago. All my 9 kids are grown up. There are 21 grandkids and 1 great-grandchild. Helen and Curtis have been married for about 55 years. They had 4 kids, but little Joey died in 48. The end of the story.